Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 401 for November 4th, 2024. So I guess officially now is the countdown to 500, which is a year, almost 2 years from now. Anyway, the 400th was a great milestone. It was a lot of fun celebrating that. I got some great shout outs on social media from listeners as well as past podcast guests. I'm actually still expecting to have a few more of those, and it's honestly never too late to do so. So if you want to help me celebrate, please post one of your favorite episodes, and it could be last week's. Post it on your social media and tag me. I'll certainly like and repost it. And, anytime this month would be fine. It was a really big deal, and I'm really proud of making it to 400 episodes, almost 8 years now. And I have no intention of stopping anytime soon. So we'll bring Bruce back for the 500th episode and have a lot of fun between now and then. I'm still looking for some help on how I might reach more people. I'm looking for feedback from you, my listeners. You can go to fdsd.me/awareness2 and fill out a little brainstorming survey that I've posted. I've gotten a few responses. I could definitely use more. And I'm still looking to see if anybody makes a really big impact along this line. I'm going to reward you in some way, shape, or form. If we get enough people doing it, I was thinking about doing like maybe a little private Zoom call to just, kind of chat and say thank you. But honestly, I don't think I've gotten enough responses yet to justify that yet. I'm kind of looking to do that maybe in January. So you got time, but I could definitely use some more help there. And finally, I did speak with Andrea Amico, head and founder and CEO of Privacy for Cars, at the Hacker Halted convention in Atlanta last Thursday on Halloween Day. That was a lot of fun. For all the times I've worked with, talked with, seen on Zoom Andrea, I'd never actually met him in person, so it was a lot of fun to hang out and have some drinks together, go do our thing. It was kind of like a dual TED Talk thing. We were both up on stage with little lavalier mics. It was a good time. I wish they had recorded it. I know they streamed it live, but it sounds like they didn't record it. If that changes, I'll let you know. But guess you had to be there. is what I'm saying. So anyway, it was a lot of fun. It was a great talk, and I really enjoyed doing it. And if you have not already, by the way, go check out privacyforcars.com. And there's a little button at the upper right. You can assert your rights, and that is most effective if you live in California right now, because that's where they actually have some privacy laws. But you can still give it a shot, and they can help you try to delete data from maybe a car that you rented or one that you sold to a dealership and forgot to wipe your data from, and also just learn a lot more about privacy and cars. So check out privacyforcars.com. All right, we got a news show for you this week, and I've actually got a lot of good news this week. We're gonna kick it off with the good stuff. The Federal Trade Commission is finally making it easier to cancel subscriptions. As easy to cancel as it was to sign up, in fact. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, another U.S. government agency, is taking action to curb unchecked worker surveillance. With the new version of macOS that just came out, with codename Sequoia, they've got one particular security feature that I want to spend a little time talking about. We're also going to talk about the right to repair and talk about the McDonald's McFlurry machines that never seem to be working, and perhaps maybe they will finally get fixed now. The European Union has actually decided to hold vendors liable for software bugs, which that could be a huge, huge sea change in how we handle vulnerabilities in software. A city has filed suit against warrantless surveillance from automated license plate readers that were sprinkled all over their town. And then we're kind of getting into this surveillance in the real world topic area. So I got a story about another case where Strava, the fitness app, is being used to track world leaders. And then an article from Ars Technica about how location tracking of our phones is getting out of control. And that's going to lead us into my tip of the week, where I'm going to talk about location tracking in general, other ways in which we are being tracked in the real world, and at least a few ideas of how you might be able to mitigate that. So, lots to talk about. Let's get to it. All right, first up, this is from The Verge. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, is taking action against subscriptions that are difficult to get rid of. On Wednesday, it adopted a final click-to-cancel rule requiring businesses to make canceling a subscription as easy as signing up. Under the rule, businesses can't force customers to cancel a subscription using a method different from how they signed up. For example, if you signed up for a subscription with an online form, companies can't require you to call them or chat with a live agent to cancel. The FTC will also require businesses to clearly disclose the terms of their subscriptions and get customer consent before charging them. The rule, which was first proposed last year, applies to any automatically renewing subscription, ranging from difficult-to-cancel gym memberships to magazine subscriptions and monthly payments for services like Amazon Prime. It also covers free trials that charge you if you don't cancel in time, along with continuity plans where you'll receive periodic product shipments until you cancel. And this is a quote from FTC Chair Lena Khan. Lena says, quote, "Too often businesses make people jump through endless hoops just to cancel a subscription. The FTC's rule will end these tricks and traps, saving Americans time and money. Nobody should be stuck paying for a service they no longer want," unquote. The click-to-cancel rule is part of the FTC's broader crackdown on shady subscription practices. Earlier this year, the agency sued Adobe for offering deceiving subscriptions that are hard to cancel. The FTC also sued Amazon over claims it tricked people into signing up for Prime and slammed Microsoft's recent changes to its Xbox Game Pass subscription. Most of the provisions in the click-to-cancel rule will go into effect 180 days after it's published in the Federal Register, which I believe has already been done. So I think some of the rules start taking effect within 60 days, but most of them 180. So yeah, this is a really good thing. And this is like a no-brainer, right? This is an example of a dark pattern. I think they've actually given clever names to a lot of these dark patterns. There's a whole website for dark patterns, by the way. It's like a studied field of bad business. And one of them, I think, was called Roach Motel. In other words, it's easy to get into and really hard to get out of. Anyway, this is a very welcome development, and I'm looking forward to seeing this soon. I'll be very curious to see if companies still manage to find some way to make this difficult. Like, you could click one button to get out, but maybe you can't find the button, or the button is labeled in some way that you don't know that it means canceling. This is the cat and mouse game that we play. So like all legislation of this sort, you got to try it. You got to put something out there, see how it works. And if you need to tweak it later, you tweak it later. All right, next up, another article about a U.S. government agency, and this is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And this is directly from consumerfinance.gov. It's a press release from them. Today, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, issued guidance to protect workers from unchecked digital tracking and opaque decision-making systems. The guidance warns that companies using third-party consumer reports, including background dossiers and surveillance-based black box AI or algorithmic scores about their workers, must follow Fair Credit Reporting Act rules, the FCRA. And that is a big deal, but I'll explain a little bit more about that when we finish reading the article. This means employers must obtain worker consent, provide transparency about data used in adverse decisions, and allow workers to dispute inaccurate information. As companies increasingly deploy invasive tools to assess workers, this ensures workers have rights over the data influencing their livelihoods and careers. And this is a quote from the CFPB director, Rohit Chopra. Quote, "Workers shouldn't be subject to unchecked surveillance or have their careers determined by an opaque third-party reports without basic protections. The kind of scoring and profiling we've long seen in credit markets is now creeping into employment and other aspects of our lives. Our action today makes clear that long-standing consumer protections apply to these new domains just as they do to traditional credit reports," unquote. Currently, such consumer reports may be used to 1. Protect worker behavior. This includes assessing the likelihood of workers engaging in union organizing activities or estimating the probability that the worker will leave their job, potentially influencing management decisions about staff retention and engagement strategies. 2. Reassigning workers. Automated systems may use data on worker performance, availability, and historical patterns to reassign team members. 3. Issue warnings or other disciplinary actions. These consumer reports might flag potential performance issues, leading to automated warnings or recommendations for disciplinary measures, potentially including firing, without direct human oversight. And 4. Evaluate social media activities. Some reports may include analysis of the worker's social media presence, potentially impacting hiring or other decisions. While background checks have long been a part of employment and hiring practices, the emergence of new technologies has expanded the scope and depth of worker tracking. These reports often contain sensitive information unknown to workers, which can significantly impact hiring decisions, job assignments, and career advancement. Inaccurate reports may cause workers to lose job opportunities, face unfair treatment, or suffer career setbacks due to information they did not even know existed, let alone had a chance to dispute. Congress passed the FCRA in response to concerns about companies that assemble detailed dossiers about consumers and sell this information. In doing so, Congress was particularly cognizant of the impact of so-called credit reporting on consumers' employment. As Congress plainly stated, and as many courts have noted, the FCRA applies both to information used for initially evaluating a consumer for employment and to information used for ongoing employment purposes. The Fair Credit Reporting Act's protections with respect to consumer reports include, first, consent. Workers often have no idea that this personal information is being collected about them and used by employers. The CFPB circular makes clear that when companies provide these reports, the law requires employers to obtain worker consent before purchasing them. This ensures that workers will be aware of and can make informed decisions about the use of their personal information in employment contexts. Second, transparency. One of the top complaints from workers is that they do not even know what information is in these dossiers. The CFPB circular emphasizes that employers are required to provide detailed information to workers when taking adverse action, including firing, denials of promotions, and demotions or other reassignments based on the reports. This allows workers to understand the basis for employment decisions and challenge any inaccuracies that may have influenced the decisions. Third, disputes. Workers also complain that this critical information is often wrong. The CFPB circular makes clear that when a worker disputes what is in a report, companies are required to correct or delete inaccurate, incomplete, or unverifiable information. This process is crucial for ensuring that workers are not unfairly penalized due to errors in these reports and have the opportunity to set the record straight. And finally, fourth, limits. It's often unclear what employers are doing with the information they obtain or if they are using it for other purposes beyond worker evaluation. The CFPB circular makes clear that employers can only use these reports for purposes that are allowed under the law. For example, employers generally cannot sell this information on the open market or use it to market financial products to their workers. These protections are essential in an era where worker data is increasingly commodified and used to make critical employment decisions. By enforcing these rights, the CFPB aims to ensure that workers have control over their personal information and are protected from abuses. The CFPB will be working with other federal agencies and state regulators to ensure the responsible use of worker data. This has been going on for a long time now, and the pandemic just made it that much worse, especially when people were working at home. A lot of companies, third-party companies, approached employers saying, hey, you can't see your workers anymore, but we can help you with that. We can help you surveil them in various ways by putting software on their laptops or other things that they take home and maybe on their smartphones that allow you to gather data on them and try to judge what they're doing, even though you can't see them. But it has been kept going even after the pandemic, and it's just getting worse. We just have this culture now of gathering as much data about people as possible and finding different ways to monetize that data. So a couple other points I want to make, though. So first of all, people search sites. We talked about this when I explained how open source intelligence works and how you might try to find and eliminate a lot of the public data about you that has been gathered and repackaged and resold by data brokers and people search sites and other things like that on the web. You'll notice that when you go to those people search sites, when you go to request information about yourself or someone else, there's all these warnings about, okay, you promised by looking at this that you're not going to use this to make employment decisions or any of that kind of stuff, because that would make them subject to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA. And they do not want to be subject to that. And of course, all this is a pinky swear thing, right? There's no enforcement. They're basically saying, you promise you're not going to use it for that purpose, and that gets them off the hook. It's a total CYA maneuver. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just absolves the data broker of liability if it does happen. But given the way this is going, of course, all contingent upon what happens in the next U.S. election, if we keep going down the route we're going on now, we're finally starting to crack down on some of these, horrible practices, nibbling at the edges of this problem until we have a broader privacy regulation for all of this data. But this is yet another good step, and I welcome it. And by the way, this is what regulation looks like, folks. This is the government coming out to protect you because the market just can't protect you from this. All the incentives are just wrong. So in situations like that, that's when we need the government to step in and protect the citizens. All right, moving on. This one's from Apple Insider. It talks about a new security feature in macOS Sequoia, which some people are kind of chafing at, and I understand that. But let me read it, and then I'll give you my take. Under earlier versions of macOS, users could override Apple's gatekeeper security feature to launch apps in the Finder by control-clicking or right-clicking on them to launch the app. The override was only needed on the app's first run, but it's still annoying nonetheless to some users. In macOS Sequoia, Apple has now removed this bypass. Apple quietly announced this change on its developer news page in a brief 2-paragraph statement. Apple added Gatekeeper and the Mac App Sandbox to macOS years back as a way to try to thwart malware. It ensures any app you download from the Mac App Store is authentic and has also been verified by Apple. Around the same time, Apple added Developer ID to certify non-App Store apps from registered Apple users. It also brought in notarization, in which developers can submit their apps to Apple for approval. These 4 parts, along with System Integrity Protection, or SIP, help keep Mac apps and files more secure at runtime. You can set Gatekeeper and Developer ID settings in System Settings, Privacy and Security, by choosing whether to allow only App Store apps or both Gatekeeper and Developer ID apps. In other words, let me stop for a second. You can go to the security settings in macOS and say whether or not you want to allow applications that were downloaded from someplace besides the Mac App Store to run on the system or not, or whether you want to keep it strict and only allow apps that come from the App Store. Okay, back to the article. The Finder, which is the file manager on macOS, will respond differently to each app launched based on these settings. It's also possible to bypass some of these security settings by turning off SIP in the terminal, but Apple doesn't recommend it, and neither do I. Before macOS Sequoia, users could override the Gatekeeper warning in Finder by control-clicking on an app when launching it. In Sequoia, Apple has now removed this bypass in another effort to secure or lock down the Mac. If you get a warning that an app is from an unknown developer or that it needs to be moved to the trash, and I'll explain that in a second, first go to System Settings, Privacy and Security, and then Security, and check for the Open Anyway button. You'll be prompted for an admin password to run the app. So they're describing an image which I'll try to describe to you. But when you first download an app that didn't come from the Mac App Store, but was at least signed by a known developer, somebody who has registered with Apple and gotten their application at least notarized by Apple, you'll get this dialog that pops up and it says, it'll show you the package you're trying to open and install. And it says, Apple could not verify this package is free of malware that may harm your Mac or compromise your privacy. And you have 2 choices. Move to trash, which is the default. In other words, throw it away and get rid of it. Or 2, done, which I guess keeps it on your system but doesn't put it in the trash. Either way, in order to run that app, you now have to go into these security settings, and it should now then be listed under the list of apps that you do or don't allow, and you'll have to check a box saying, yes, allow this app to run. Apple removing the bypass may cause more annoyance for some Mac users, since doing so now requires a trip to the system settings on every app first run for non-Mac App Store apps. There's not much users can do about this other than disabling SIP, which again, Apple doesn't recommend, and again, neither do I. Also note that as this article mentions, and of course that's a link that you would have to read the article to click, third-party Mac developers have to add an extended attribute to their app download distributions if the apps are distributed outside the Mac App Store. Although most developers will honor this requirement, it's still possible that some won't, leaving some downloads as a security risk, which can bypass some of Apple's app security in some cases. So that's weird. I'm surprised Apple allows that. If you're going to make this update, then and some app developer didn't do this thing, I would think you would default to not allowing it to run at all. So anyway, a couple quick comments. First of all, I've talked before about how Apple has kind of anti-malware features built into it, but they don't really call it an antivirus thing like Microsoft does with Windows Defender. But yeah, it's got built-in protections against malware. One of the main things it does is it tries to get you to get everything from the Apple Mac App Store. So everything in there has been vetted to some degree, at least by Apple. And so you can kind of assume that just about anything you get from there is safe. And everything in there has a privacy statement as far as what kind of data is collected about it. So you can see that before you buy or install the app. And so what we're talking about here are applications from developers who decided not to use the Mac App Store. One reason they might do that is they don't want to pay 30% to Apple of everything they make on their app. It's actually not all 30%. Sometimes it's, for most small developers, it's 15%, and it could be less than that, I think, too. Anyway, the point is, for whatever reason, they have decided they don't want to go through the App Store. They want you to download it like in the old days where you go to their website, you find their download link, you download the file, and you install it that way. When you do it that way, if they have registered as being a official Apple developer and they get their developer ID and they go through the process of telling Apple, here's my app, I'm not going through the App Store, but please notarize this app so that when people try to install it, you will allow that to happen. Because if it's not notarized, Apple won't even let you run it at all. So now they're just making this process of running a non-Mac App Store app a little bit more difficult, which, for people who install a lot of software, especially for maybe people like me, developers who quite often install software that is not in the Mac App Store, yeah, this is going to make it a little bit more painful. But honestly, I am willing to deal with that inconvenience because I think for the vast, vast majority of people, this makes things more safe. Yes, it's much more restrictive, and I understand, that will certainly make some people chafe. But most of the people I'm trying to reach are people that I just want to hit the easy button for. I want them to be secure by default. And for the people who know enough to go beyond that, they know how to do this too, and it's just a little bit harder for them to do. Some people look at this as kind of a nanny state kind of thing. I understand that. And a lot of those people are Windows people because they just don't like all the hoops that Apple makes them jump through and all the restrictions that Apple puts on them and what they can do on their own computer. I get that. And if you're that kind of person, then by all means, run Windows or run Linux. One more thing I will add to this before I move on. You also should not be running an administrator account as your quote-unquote daily driver account, the one you use every day. By default, if you have one account on your machine, it's an administrator account. It's a quote-unquote God account. It has the most power. But that means that anything that you can do, malware that gets on your machine can also do, because that malware has the same permissions that you do. So you can limit your own abilities by downgrading your everyday account to just a standard user, which means that you need permission to do certain things like install new software or make, important system changes. And the easiest way to do that is to create a second admin account, a brand new administrator account, and then from that other account, downgrade your daily driver account to a standard account. That way you don't lose anything. You don't have to move everything to a new account. You just create a new account and then downgrade the permissions of your main account. And if you're curious, there are steps in my book that tell you exactly how to do that with pictures and everything. All right, let's keep moving. This next one is from 404 Media. And it's called, "It is now legal to hack McFlurry machines and medical devices to fix them." It is now legal to hack or otherwise bypass technical protection measures on McFlurry, and this is the McDonald's ice cream machine, McFlurry machines, and other commercial food preparation machines in order to repair them thanks to a new rule issued by the federal government. After a challenge, it has also remained legal to circumvent manufacturer locks that prevent the repair of medical equipment. This is good news in several long-running yet somehow related sagas that has resulted in both a huge number of McDonald's ice cream machines and a large number of medical devices being broken at any given moment, and which often cannot be fixed without the help of their manufacturer due to arbitrary software locks that prevent McDonald's stores and also hospitals from fixing the devices they own. The new exemptions to Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is something we've talked about on the show quite a bit over the years, allows for the circumvention of DRM, or digital rights management, and software locks, which are often called TPMs, or technical protection measures, on equipment made for, quote, commercial food preparation when circumvention is a necessary step to allow the diagnosis, maintenance, or repair of such a device, unquote. The exemption that allows for the circumvention of software locks on, quote, a lawfully acquired medical device or system and related data files when circumvention is a necessary step to allow the diagnosis, maintenance, or repair of such a device or system, unquote, was also renewed, as were exemptions for farm equipment and a host of other devices. If this all sounds like an absurd state of affairs, it is. Manufacturers of everything from video game consoles to tractors to ventilators to ice cream machines, kitchen appliances, and trains have learned over the years that they can make a lot of money by putting digital rights management systems and technical protection measures on the hardware that they make that do nothing besides preventing the people who buy their equipment from diagnosing and repairing the devices they've purchased. This has helped create many different but functionally related repair monopolies across all sorts of industries. The Section 1201 rulemaking process is a part of the copyright law that allows the Library of Congress's Copyright Office to make rules that essentially make it legal for repair professionals and device owners to find ways to hack the machines they've purchased for the purposes of repair. I've covered the McFlurry issue many times over the years. Basically, a company named Taylor makes the soft-serve ice cream machine McDonald's uses to make McFlurries. These break constantly, and Taylor has put embedded software lockout systems that prevent anyone besides quote-unquote authorized repair professionals from fixing them. In the interim, McDonald's franchises have found ways to bypass these lockout codes. There is ongoing litigation in which a company called Kitch, Kytch, made a device that automated this process. iFixit and digital rights group Public Knowledge petitioned the Library of Congress for this exemption, and Friday it was granted. In a document about its reasoning for the new exemptions, the Copyright Office explained that the Kitch litigation and the untenable McFlurry situation ultimately led to grant the exemption. Similarly, I've written about how trained technicians at hospitals have been prevented from making simple repairs and doing simple diagnostics on ventilators and other medical equipment, which has led to perfectly good equipment being kept out of commission for weeks or months at a time. Bypassing these technical protection measures was made legal in 2021, but medical device manufacturers launched an intense campaign to kill renewal of it this year. The Copyright Office was not swayed. Unfortunately, the Copyright Office did not grant an exemption for all industrial equipment, which petitioners also asked for, so the commercial food equipment exemption will be limited to devices in restaurants. Kyle Wines, CEO of iFixit, who petitioned for several exemptions and whose company did a teardown of the Taylor ice cream machine, told 404 Media that the new rules are a bit of a mixed bag because industrial equipment was left out and because it does not legalize the sale of tools that would bypass software locks. And this is a quote from Kyle, quote, "This exemption is helpful, but what we really need is Congress to solve this problem and truly legalize repair. Here's the catch. While it's now legal to circumvent the digital locks on these machines, the ruling does not allow us to share or distribute the tools necessary to do so. This is a major limitation. Most franchise owners and independent repair shops won't have the technical expertise to create their own unlocking tools from scratch, meaning that while the door to repair has been opened, few will be able to walk through it without significant difficulty. It is still a crime for iFixit to sell a tool to fix ice cream machines, and that's a real shame." On the call with reporters, I asked Wilson if the Copyright Office supports the idea of repair legislation in Congress. Wilson said, quote, "Yes, we do support the consideration by Congress of a permanent exemption in areas where it's dealing with computer software and repair," unquote. So let me clarify something. So this thing with the Copyright Office out of the Library of Congress, it's really weird. I think it's every 3 years that they can petition to change what is exempted from this horrible, horrible law. And when the DMCA was basically put in place, Cory Doctorow has talked about this endlessly. In fact, we had a great set of interviews on this called Adversarial Interoperability. This is the situation where somebody comes along and makes compatible ink cartridges for a printer, and then the printer manufacturer tries to find ways to make them not work because that's where they make their money, is selling these ridiculously overpriced ink cartridges. So ever since the DMCA came out, it basically said that if you wrap anything in DRM, if you put any sort of a technical protective measure around something in software, and it could just be a little tiny bit of code, if you put that around there, that it becomes illegal to break that or to sell anything that would allow someone else to break that, with really hefty fines and jail time. So instead, what we have is every 3 years, you have to re-petition to get your particular situation fixed. In this case, it's fixing McFlurry machines and medical stuff, but it expires. Like, it's not, once you've got that exemption, you have to keep fighting for it every time this comes back up again. So it's just dumb. And Congress really, really needs to fix this. All right, next up, this is big. This is a really big deal. And I don't know how this is going to play out. But it hit multiple different news outlets, and I'm going to read one here from Risky Business. The European Union has updated its product liability law to cover software and associated risks like security flaws and planned obsolescence. The new EU directive on liability for defective products replaces one of the EU's oldest directives and will provide consumers with legal tools to hold companies liable in court if they sell defective products. The biggest change to the old directive is the addition of software products to the list of covered goods. Companies that sell or want to sell in the EU will have to make significant changes to how they are currently doing business if they have failed to invest in proper software development and cybersecurity practices, which, by the way, is probably just about everybody. The new directive extends liability to vendors for software that contains security flaws and those flaws that lead to any damage to consumers. This includes both physical damage caused by defective or insecure software, but also material damage, such as loss of functionality and features, loss of financial assets, and others. The directive also classifies the lack of software update mechanism to be a product defect and makes the vendor liable. Software vendors are also forbidden to withhold information about a software update's negative impact, and I'll come back to that in a second. The only exemption in liability coverage is when the software update requires the consumer to manually install an update, but generally the directive sees vendors liable as long as they have control over their product after sale. The directive also extends liability to vendors who use any type of planned obsolescence system to artificially reduce the lifespan of their products. This includes software designed to slow down a device, hardware components engineered to fail after a certain period, or an update that degrades the software's performance in order to entice users to move to a new service, tier, or product. Companies can also be held liable for misleading consumers about a product's durability, repairability, or expected lifespan. The directive requires victims to prove a product's defectiveness, but also adds a new legal mechanism to force vendors to make required evidence available. The new rules exclude free and open source software from its requirements. That's very interesting and honestly a good idea. The new directive was approved earlier this year by the EU's Parliament and earlier this month by the EU Council. It is set to go into effect in 24 months in the fall of 2026. So it's still got a ways to go before it goes into effect, which means, of course, that that's 2 years that, this could all be undone. But this is a really big deal. I mean, this is something that I've been saying, and a lot of other people in cybersecurity have been saying, is the real problem with software today is that there is no liability. When you install these products or buy a product with software built in and you agree to the terms of service by turning it on or opening the box or clicking that first pop-up that nobody reads, you're basically saying you're using this software as is. We are off the hook. If anything goes wrong, it's not our problem. I mean, when has there ever been a product that's been allowed to say that? Somehow, software got a pass on this stuff, and it's led to a lot of really crappy software. Companies don't invest in making software secure because there's very little payback for that. It's not something you can really see, so it's really hard to market, and it costs a lot of money. And if nothing ever goes wrong, you never even know it's there. So one of the comments this thing here makes that I thought was interesting was, withholding information about a software update's negative impact, meaning, and they do kind of explain this a little bit later, but there have definitely been cases where products have gotten quote-unquote software updates that have degraded the performance of the device, or in some cases bricked it. But in other cases, it's really just a matter of where they take away features that they used to have built into the product, and because there's no legal downside for them doing so. If they want to get you to go to a newer product, or they want to stop supporting the older product, they try to make it unpalatable to keep using that older product. And so sometimes they downgrade the performance, or they take away features or things like that. And this is covered by that as well too. So this is really interesting. And because of the way software works, most companies try to avoid writing different versions of software for their products because it's just a pain in the butt to keep them up to date and to keep them tested and all these things separately. If you have to do two versions of this, one for the EU and one for not the EU, that already doubles a lot of your effort. Even if the software development isn't doubled, all the testing and all the support and all that other stuff is definitely doubled. So it's quite possible that even those of us not in the EU will benefit from this. So I'll be very interested to see how this plays out. And of course, we still have 2 years before any of this takes effect. So it's going to be a while. Next up, one more article from 404 Media, and it's about warrantless mass surveillance. This particular one is about automated license plate readers. A civil liberties organization has filed a federal lawsuit in Virginia arguing that widespread surveillance enabled by Flock, a company that sells networks of automated license plate readers, is unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment. And this is a quote from the lawsuit. Quote, "The city of Norfolk, Virginia has installed a network of cameras that make it functionally impossible for people to drive anywhere without having their movements tracked, photographed, and stored in an AI-assisted database that enables the warrantless surveillance of their every move. This civil rights lawsuit seeks to end this dragnet surveillance program. In Norfolk, no one can escape the government's 172 unblinking eyes," unquote, referring to the 172 Flock cameras currently operational in Norfolk. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures and has been ruled in many cases to protect against warrantless government surveillance, and the lawsuit specifically says Norfolk's installation violates that. Flock cameras, which are called automated license plate readers, or ALPRs, have become incredibly popular all over the United States. More than 5,000 communities around the country have the cameras, which use AI to passively and constantly check which cars are driving by them. Flock has made several incredibly lofty claims over the years, which includes, quote, "Flock will have eliminated crime in America in 10 years," unquote. The lawsuit in Norfolk is being filed by the Institute for Justice, a civil liberties organization that has filed a series of privacy and government overreach lawsuits over the last few years. The two Virginia residents, Lee Schmidt and Crystal Arrington, are listed as plaintiffs in the case. Schmidt is a Navy veteran who alleges in the lawsuit that the cops can easily infer where he is going based on Flock data. And here's another quote from the lawsuit, quote, "Just outside his neighborhood, there are 4 Flock cameras. Lee drives by these cameras and others he sees around town nearly every day, and the Norfolk Police Department, the NPD, can use the information they record to build a picture of his daily habits and routines. If the Flock cameras record Lee going straight through the intersection outside his neighborhood, for example, the NPD can infer he's going to his daughter's school. If the cameras capture him going right, the NPD can infer that he is going to the shooting range. If the cameras capture him turning left, the NPD can infer that he is going to the grocery store. The Flock cameras capture the start of nearly every trip Lee makes in his car, so he effectively cannot leave his neighborhood without the NPD knowing about it," unquote. Arrington is a healthcare worker who makes home visits to clients in Norfolk. The lawsuit alleges that it would be trivial for the government to identify her clients. Robert Fromer, one of the lawyers in the case, told 404 Media that the lawsuit could have been easily filed in any one of the more than 5,000 communities where Flock is active, but that Norfolk made sense because the Fourth Circuit of Appeals, which Norfolk is a part of, recently held that permanent, warrantless drone surveillance in Baltimore is unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment in a case called Beautiful Struggle versus Baltimore Police Department. And this is a quote from Fromer, quote, "The Beautiful Struggle opinion was about a comparatively crude system, just a drone that was flying in the air for 12 hours a day that at most had a couple pixels on a map that made it hard to identify anyone. By contrast, anyone with the Flock cameras has a crystal clear record of your car, a digital fingerprint that can track you anywhere you go. The police chief even said you can't really go anywhere in Norfolk without being caught by one of these cameras," unquote. Fromer is right. Norfolk Police Chief Mark Talbert said last year, quote, "It would be difficult to drive anywhere of any distance without running into a camera," unquote. Earlier this year, a Virginia state court ordered that information pulled from a Flock camera without a warrant and used in a robbery case against Javon Bell had to be suppressed because it violated the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights. In that case, Judge Jamela LaCruz noted that, quote, "It would not be difficult for mistakes to be made tying law-abiding citizens to crime due to the nature of the Flock system, and in the event a law enforcement would seek to create a suspect where one did not otherwise exist, it would be a simple task," unquote. In a statement sent after publication, Flock pointed 404 Media to several recent cases where judges denied defendants' motions to suppress evidence collected by Flock on Fourth Amendment grounds. And so this is a quote from the Flock spokesperson, quote, "Fourth Amendment case law overwhelmingly shows that license plate readers do not constitute a warrantless search because they take photos of cars in public and cannot continuously track the movements of any individual. Appellate and federal district courts in at least 14 states have upheld the use of evidence from license plate readers as constitutional without requiring a warrant, as well as the 9th and 11th Circuits. Since the Bell case, 4 judges in Virginia have ruled the opposite way, that ALPR evidence is admissible in court without a warrant. License plates are issued by the government for the express purpose of identifying vehicles in public places for safety reasons. Courts have consistently found that there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in a license plate on a vehicle on a public road, and photographing one is not a Fourth Amendment search," unquote. In the most recent of these cases, U.S. v. Martin, a judge ruled, quote, "There is simply no expectation of privacy in the exterior of one's vehicle or while driving it on public thoroughfares," unquote. Norfolk also procured Flock without any city council process. But even if it had, Fromer said, quote, "To be honest, our constitutional rights aren't up for debate. This isn't something where we could just say, oh, we decided to throw away your Fourth Amendment rights because we think it's worthwhile. Well-meaning investigators are always going to want the latest and greatest tools, but those tools come at a cost to our security and our privacy. So we need courts to be involved to strike that balance rather than just let investigators decide for themselves what they can do," unquote. So this is a tricky topic. And I actually had a very interesting discussion with somebody who stopped by to see Andrea and I after we talked at the conference last week. And I'm not going to give any information on this person because they didn't authorize me to do so. But this is a tricky subject. I understand the need for law enforcement to catch bad guys. I get it. I also partially understand this idea that, well, you have no expectation of privacy in a public space. But that is kind of facile. And I think there's a lot of situations where that doesn't necessarily hold true. For example, if I'm sitting on a park bench with somebody in the middle of a public park, let's say Central Park, lots of people there, I'm quite obviously out in public. But if I'm leaning over next to this person having a conversation, I would not, let's say, expect that conversation to be video recorded and audio recorded such that anybody else could hear that. Furthermore, once we start talking about these automated systems for doing surveillance, that's not just a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind, which is something that we talked about with Bruce Schneier just last week. In the past, this kind of surveillance was limited by, human capabilities, like their ability to remember and write stuff down or maybe take pictures, and just how many humans you had. So it was kind of naturally self-limiting. And so, surveillance in the past, when you're doing a stakeout or following somebody or going down to the local bodega to try to get a copy of a videotape from where a crime occurred or things like that, that involved real people and real humans. And it was self-limiting because there's only so many humans that could do this and then only so many hours a day that it can happen. Once you start bringing, automation into this where everything could be recorded all the time and saved forever, and then processed by computers after the fact, that is different. And we need to somehow address that difference in our laws. And I still think that things like automatic license plate readers and certainly facial recognition on public camera systems, when you can collect and store and record and process and centralize all of that data forever, that is different. That you can't just simply say that you'd have no expectation of privacy once you walk out your front door. When you have these kind of technical capabilities, that changes the nature of the argument, and we need to figure that out and come up with laws that make more sense. Okay, next up, and this is a very, very short one from Schneier.com, and it's very short because Bruce always keeps it short, and he refers to some articles that are behind a paywall, which I can't read. But I think you're still going to get the gist of this pretty quickly, and I just wanted to throw it in because it's related to where we're going to go with our tip of the week. And it's entitled Tracking World Leaders Using Strava. Way back in 2018, people noticed that you could find secret military bases using data published by the Strava fitness app. Soldiers and other military personnel were using them to track their runs, and you could look at the public data and find places where there should be no people running. So in other words, these secret military bases, I think like in Afghanistan and other places in that area, these were not supposed to be on the map anywhere. But because these military personnel were running laps around the compound, and Strava, the app, collected all this data anonymously and published, here's all the fun places people are walking, in case you want to find a popular place to go run, was showing that there were these, running routes that were very popular out in the middle of nowhere where there's not supposed to be anything, and revealing the location of these secret sites. And so the second paragraph from Bruce's article is, 6 years later, the problem remains. Le Monde, which is, of course, the huge French newspaper, has reported that the same Strava data can be used to track the movements of world leaders. They don't wear the tracking advice, but many of their bodyguards do. So, that's literally it for that article. This next one is a good bit longer, and this is the last one, and this will lead right into the tip of the week. And so the tip of the week this week is about location data tracking. It's really running rampant. There are all sorts of technologies being used against us to track our movements and our locations. And I don't just mean here or there. It's everywhere all the time with high resolution. It's as if everywhere you're going leaves a trail behind you that can be recorded and saved forever. So this last article I'm going to read is from Ars Technica, and Dan Goodin, which is a great writer and a great security and privacy guy, is about location tracking with phones and how it's out of control and some of the things you can do about that. And then I'll lead into my tip of the week, where I'm going to talk a little more broadly about other things, like we've talked about automated license plate readers and other ways that we are tracked, not just online, but in the real world, and what, if anything, we could do about that. So first up, this is from Ars Technica. You likely have never heard of Babel Street or Location X, but chances are good that they know a lot about you and anyone else you know who keeps a phone nearby around the clock. Reston, Virginia located Babel Street is a little-known firm behind Location X, a service with the capability to track the locations of hundreds of millions of phone users over sustained periods of time. Ostensibly, Babel Street limits the use of the service to personnel and contractors of the U.S. government law enforcement agencies, including state entities. Despite the restriction, an individual working on behalf of a company that helps people remove their personal information from consumer data broker databases recently was able to obtain a 2-week free trial by truthfully telling Babel Street he was considering performing contracting work for a government agency in the future. Krebs on Security, one of the 5 news outlets that obtained access to the data produced during the trial, said that one capability of Location X is the ability to draw a line between 2 states or other locations, or a shape around a building, street block, or entire city, and see a historical record of internet-connected devices that traversed those boundaries. Reporter Brian Krebs said that the data included nearly 100,000 hits for the phone of a New Jersey police officer who recently became a victim of an intense doxing campaign that subjected her and her family to dozens of death threats from people who knew her home address and the phone numbers of both her and her husband. The campaign included masked people in cars driving outside the family's home. The data seen by the person using the 2-week trial provided a detailed and intimate picture of the officer over several months. There's no indication that the people stalking and harassing the family used Location X, but there's little doubt that the service could have allowed them to determine the officer's phone number and residence location. 404 Media, another outlet given access to the data, reported that the trove allowed a reporter to zoom in on the parking lot of an abortion clinic in Florida and observe more than 70 red dots, each representing a phone that had recently visited the clinic. Location X then allowed the reporter to trace the movements of one specific device. The device, and by extension the person carrying it, began the journey in mid-June from a residence in Alabama. The person passed by a Lowe's home improvement store, drove on the highway, visited a church, crossed into Florida, and finally stopped at the clinic where the phone indicates the person stayed for 2 hours before leaving and returning to Alabama. The data tracked the phone as having visited the clinic only once. The technology making this vast data collection possible is, of course, tracking mechanisms built into Android and iOS and the apps that run on those operating systems. By default, Android assigns a unique ad ID to each device and makes it available to any app that has location permissions. iOS, by contrast, keeps its identifier for advertisers tracker private, but gives each installed app the opportunity to request access to it. Some apps are given permission to access a phone's location and then sell the device's location to consumer data brokers. The data can also be made available through the web ad ecosystem. When an ad-supported page loads, the advertising network holds an auction in real time, and we've talked about this before, this is the real-time bidding process, to sell a personalized ad to the highest bidder. A key piece of information bidders use to set a price is, you guessed it, the location of the device running the browser. Advertisers generate additional revenue by selling that history to the likes of Location X provider Babel Street. There are multiple settings that phone users must choose to close off the constant leaking of their locations. For users of either Android or iOS, the first step is to audit which apps currently have permission to access the device location. This can be done on Android by accessing Settings, Location, App Location Permissions, and on iOS by going to Settings, Privacy and Security, Location Services. Both operating systems will display a list of apps and whether they are permitted access always, never, or only when the app is in use, or to prompt for the permission each time. Both also allow users to choose whether the app sees precise locations down to a few feet or only a coarse-grained location, like maybe city level or something like that. For most users, there's usefulness in allowing an app for photos, transit, or maps to access a user's precise location. For other classes of apps, say for those for internet jukeboxes at bars and restaurants, it can be helpful for them to have an approximate location, but giving them precise, fine-grained access is likely overkill. And for other apps, there's no reason for them to ever know the device's location. With a few exceptions, there's little reason for apps to always have location access. Not surprisingly, Android users who want to block intrusive location gathering have more settings to change than iOS users. The first thing to do is access Settings, Security and Privacy, Ads, and choose Delete Advertising ID. Then promptly ignore the long, scary warning Google provides and hit the button confirming the decision at the bottom. If you don't see that setting, good for you. It means you already deleted it. Google provides documentation here, and of course that's a link you'd have to read the article for, which is in the show notes if you want to follow. iOS, by default, doesn't give apps access to identifier for advertisers, Apple's version of the unique tracking number assigned to iPhones, iPads, and Apple TVs. Apps, however, can display a window asking that the setting be turned on, so it's useful to check. iPhone users can do this by accessing Settings, Privacy and Security, and Tracking. Any apps with permission to access the unique ID will appear. And in my case, there were none, so that means that I had not given that permission to anybody. While there, users should also turn off the Allow Apps to Request Track button. While in iOS Privacy and Security, users should navigate to Apple Advertising and ensure personalized ads is turned off. And then there's this last kind of odd paragraph that says, additional coverage of Location X from Haaretz and Notice, N-O-T-U-S, is here and here. The New York Times, the other publication given access to the data, hadn't posted an article at the time this Rs post went live. So the New York Times has this, which means I am looking for a killer expose on this from Kashmir Hill. And, maybe I'll get lucky. Maybe I actually get her back on the show to talk about it when that comes out. But yeah, location tracking has gotten really bad. There's all sorts of ways that you can be tracked. And this article, by the way, is only talking about smartphone location tracking. So let's move on to my tip of the week, where I'll talk about other ways you can be tracked and what you can do about that. So my tip of the week this week is how to curb some of this real-life location tracking. And as always, if you're a newsletter subscriber, you're already having this article sitting in your inbox, and you can always go to firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com and check out the article there. There's a lot of links in these articles, as usual, so I'm going to kind of give you some highlights here, but if you want more details, absolutely go to my website and look at the most recent article, which has lots of other information. So we talked in this article already about smartphones tracking you, and this happens not only in this real-time bidding stuff, it also happens with this advertiser stuff. Also, the apps themselves do it if you give them permission to track your location. And I've seen things dumb enough like flashlight apps that want your location, which makes no sense. But it's because in a lot of these cases, the app makers get kickbacks, get money from sharing this information with third-party data brokers. And it's even so bad that in some cases that a lot of these app developers are using off-the-shelf software development kits that have location tracking built into them that is sending that information off to these data brokers automatically, and they don't even know what's going on. But it's even worse than that, because in the real world, your phone has lots of different radios in it. It's got a cellular radio, which is being tracked by your cellular provider. It knows roughly where you are based on cell phone, what cell phone towers that you've been connected to. Your device also has more than likely a Bluetooth radio in it and a Wi-Fi radio in it as well. And the way those technologies work is they're always looking for something to connect to. And so very often, part of that process, unbeknownst to you behind the scenes in this invisible wireless way, is they're kind of broadcasting like, hey, this is who I am. Does anybody want to talk to me? And that who I am part is usually a unique identifier, like a MAC address, if you're familiar with those on networking. And so Apple and Google have actually put in some interesting technology that allows you to randomize that ID that you're broadcasting so that it's not the same ID all the time. But there are stores that are looking for these things. They actually, like big box stores and malls and things like that, are actually watching and monitoring the IDs that are being shouted out by these phones as they walk around to kind of track you through the area. They may not know your name, but they would recognize you as, hey, that person was here last week, and they spent 5 minutes looking at the window of Victoria's Secret. And, so maybe I should see if I could, get them a coupon or something. And if you go into one of these stores and buy something, that's a possibility. At that point, they might actually be able to match your wireless ID with your name. And if they share that, then the game's up. Unless you have these randomization features turned on, which would mean that the ID doesn't, changes every time you come back. And that's just cell phones. We already talked about automated license plate readers, and these new technologies are both fixed and mobile. Oftentimes, they're in fixed locations. They're just cameras that are mounted somewhere, hooked up to a network, and just take a picture of every car that goes by and records the license plates, which of course they can look up to see who owns that vehicle, right? But they're doing more than just license plate now. They're actually kind of fingerprinting vehicles. They're looking at, if they can determine it, make, model, even remembering what bumper stickers are on a vehicle. So, that's a little creepy because oftentimes those bumper stickers are kind of personality things. They could be political bumper stickers, let's say. But there's also mobile automated license plate readers. For example, some city vehicles, including police vehicles, sometimes are equipped with cameras that are also hooked up to license plate readers. And when they have downtime, they will often go drive through public parking lots, like at sporting events or at airport parking lots, because they're looking automatically, like all they have to do is just drive around and the software does everything else. They're looking for stolen vehicles or cars that are wanted in some sort of a crime or things like that. And just also along the way, recording every car that's there and when they saw it. But it even gets worse than that. Again, like the bumper sticker thing, some of these ALPR systems are also just taking other images and looking for things like yard signs. Like, maybe you've got a political yard sign with the upcoming election in your front yard. And if one of these vehicles drives by with this software running, they may take note of that as well. And then we've got digital cameras everywhere now too. These cameras, unlike the old days that were hooked up to a little VHS machine in the back room that gets erased every couple of weeks, these cameras are all connected to the internet. They're probably being run by third parties, and those third parties potentially can save that data forever, can share it with others, and can now start using things like facial recognition to identify the people that are in those videos. And as Andrea Amico will tell you, and we told our audience last week, your car is a privacy nightmare. Your car has a built-in cellular modem, which you cannot turn off and you can't remove because it would void your warranty, but it's also going to mean that you don't get a lot of safety features, like when you crash, calling 911 on your behalf. Cars also have built-in GPS because they almost all have built-in navigation systems now, which means your car is tracking your location precisely, constantly. And then something else you may or may not have thought about, but those of us who live near toll roads and have those little toll booth electronic beacons in our car so that we can just drive right through without having to stop and to pay, you probably shouldn't be surprised to know that those little beacons are not tracked only when you go through toll booths. In fact, there was a really cool DEF CON presentation, which I linked to in my article, where somebody hacked their Easy Pass to make a sound every time it was queried. And it was queried in more locations than just toll booths. Okay, so you might still be thinking, look, I don't care. I'm boring. Yeah, I go to work. I go to school. I go to church, which maybe I don't care if anybody knows where I go to church, and I visit my relatives, and who cares? Well, this brings up another famous quote, and that is, it was Cardinal Richelieu who said something along the lines of, "Give me 6 lines written in the hand of the most honest man, and I will find something in them with which to hang him." Meaning, if I could really track everything you've ever done, every place you've ever been, I can find something that looks fishy. I can find some reason to go after you if, let's say, I'm in law enforcement. But also, let's say I just don't like you, or maybe I'm a jilted ex-lover, or maybe I'm just a creep, a stalker. If I can buy this information on the open market, then I can use that to get up to some pretty nasty stuff. I also might be able to use this information to shame you or blackmail you. There's the classic case of the Catholic priest who used the Grindr app, which was for gay dating, who was outed because some concerned religious group bought some of that data in order to try to find priests who might be gay, and they outed him. In fact, I think that priest just sued them for that. And then if you really want to get dark, you can start thinking about your kids, even if you don't care about yourself. If I can track you, I can track your kids, and that could get really ugly. Okay, so moving on to the solutions part of this, unfortunately, a lot of these things you can't do much about. Certainly, you can't do anything about automated license plate readers. I mean, you could, I guess you could vandalize them, which I'm not recommending. But there's really not a whole lot you can do. They were deployed, by your city for some reason or another. And so you can only really follow the political process there to try to get them taken down or get them restricted on how they're used, and maybe at least help improve the security and how long the data is retained. And, there are mitigations and compromises that can be found there. But directly, there's nothing you could really do. You can't cover your license plate, for example. Same thing with toll booth trackers. Same thing, honestly, with facial recognition. If there's a camera somewhere and someone is taking video of you, if they sell it to the right third party, you could potentially be identified. So what can you do? Well, as the article we just read talked about, I'm not going to repeat all those, but there are things you could do on your smartphone. For example, look at the permissions you've given to all the apps you've put on your phone and make sure you've restricted which of those apps can access your location. And furthermore, dial down when they can access it or maybe how fine-grained the location information will be. You can, on iOS at least, you can tell apps not to track you 100% all the time. Don't even ask. That's one big button. And then if previous to that, you had said yes to some of them, if you go to that place in the settings on iOS, you can revoke that permission retroactively there as well. Android is not the same. You can't say no to everything. I mean, Google's an advertising company. You can rotate your IDs from time to time to kind of randomize your identity, but that's not nearly as good as being able to shut it off entirely. If you don't use Wi-Fi or don't use Bluetooth that often, you can turn them off when you're not using them, but I use them all the time, and that doesn't really make sense for me. But that is something you could do if those are, for some reason, features you don't often use. The Electronic Frontier Foundation actually has a really cool website called the Atlas of Surveillance. And some of what they have there is actually they've done some research and tried to map out where some of these license plate readers are and cameras are, I think is what they're trying to do there. But there's also just some really good resources there along the lines of things I'm talking about here for things you could do to try to protect your privacy in public places. And then finally, if you really want to kick it up a notch, you could buy a Faraday case for your phone. Now, if you're going to go to a political rally where you're worried that someone might track you there, or you're going to an abortion clinic for reproductive care and you don't want anybody to know that you went there, honestly, your best bet is just to leave your phone at home. Because even when you turn those things off, they're not always really off. So the other option in cases like that is to use what's called a Faraday cage, and it's named after the guy who invented the concept. But it's a wire mesh bag that is built such that if you put your phone into it, it blocks all manner of wireless signals coming in or out of that bag. So if that interests you at all, there's you can look those things up. If you search for Faraday case or Faraday bag, you will find several examples there if you'd like to give that a try. So there you have it, such as it is. We had a lot of good news this week. Fortunately, my tip of the week is a little bit of a downer because it's pretty scary and there's not a lot you can do about it. So I've given you some things that you can do to mitigate this. But unfortunately, for some of the most egregious of these tracking technologies, we've got to work this out with our, by electing the right representatives, by going to the town council meetings, by pushing back where we can, and going through the, fight town hall kind of a process. So there you have it, your news and your tip of the week. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for this week. Thanks for tuning in. I got some great interviews on the horizon. Next week, we're going to be talking to Stacey Higginbotham, who is an IoT guru. We're going to talk about security and privacy around IoT devices, which is generally pretty poor. Then more news, and then we're going to talk to Carissa Veliz, the author of Privacy is Power. It's a fantastic book and a fantastic interview. Can't wait for you to hear that. Also, later this month, right before Black Friday here in the U.S., when the holiday shopping season kind of officially kicks off, that's when I put out my best and worst gift guide. So look for that both in blog form and here as your tip of the week. And by the way, if you have any interesting suggestions, I'm trying to find some new and interesting things to put on that best and worst gift guide list, particularly the best part, trying to find some new products to recommend that are very privacy and security focused. So if you have any of those ideas, reach out to me. You can send them to feedback@firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. All right, that's it. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.